You are listening to Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White.
And today our guest is
Steve Nawara.
Steve, can you tell us about your position here at Lewis University?
Yeah, I'm a professor in political science. I'm the chair of the political science department at Lewis University. I've taught at Lewis since 2013.
And didn't you have a role in the Senate for a while?
Yeah, I was the faculty senate president until May, and I just did not run any longer. And now I have a little bit more free time, so I can go on podcasts like this.
That's awesome.
Nice.
That's awesome.
That's exactly why you didn't run.
So as scientists, we're also very interested in politics. And we know about these wonderful theories of evolution that talk about how organisms evolve in time. And that also applies to social organisms, such as political parties. So one of the first topics we're going to have today, talking with Steve, is about the evolution of political parties and within the United States, just within the history. And I know for a fact that, in my lifetime, I've been around for quite some time, to look at the evolution of the Democratic and the Republican Party just within the past 20, 30, 40 years. But, of course, these parties go back hundreds of years.
Yeah, I don't know how much history your listeners know if they're largely science-based, but I just took my daughter to see Hamilton last week. And in that play, they go over the development of the two-party system because, of course, political parties are not mentioned at all in the Constitution. They're something that came about after the government was already established. And so when George Washington was the first president, he didn't run as a partisan at all. And it wasn't until the various members of the cabinet and the congressional coalition started forming, you started to see patterns. We can look back at roll call votes today to see that certain people tended to vote with each other all the time. We look at the individual
They formed cliques.
Yeah. The technical term, they formed dyads. Right? You can throw all the roll call data into a computer and start seeing that the one representative from Pennsylvania would almost always vote with the same representative from New Hampshire and so forth. And what ended up developing out of this was the development of the Federalist Party, largely led by Alexander Hamilton, and then the Democratic Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson. And what ends up happening is, like you said, there's an evolution that takes place. Over the first few elections, it was a pretty close split between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and eventually the Federalists they lost. Over time, their influence, at least electorally, kind of went away, and we ended up with this weird time period for about 20 years where only Democratic Republicans were winning elections in this country, and we had a one-party system. But that wasn't something that was really sustainable because humans are always going to have differences and not like to agree with one another. And as a result, kind of split again.
I was just going to ask, this is kind of anecdotal in my mind. I'm not sure it's actually true. Seems like there's very few scientists and a lot of lawyers in representation as politicians. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so that really gets into who politicians are.
Criminals. No, I'm
yeah.
kidding.
Well, the easy answer that I would first spit out is, of course, is that politicians have to deal with writing a lot of laws, especially in Congress. And so people with a legal background have a little bit of a leg up on that. But I think it's deeper than that, that in the United States, we don't have we don't have public funding of political campaigns. And so to run for office, you typically need to spend your own money, at least in the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, or you have to be very good at fundraising. And so lawyers are kind of uniquely suited because a lot of times they have some wealth so they can get started. Also, they are connected with other people who have wealth so they can fundraise. And then on top of that, what else do you need is time.
And charm.
Yeah, well, the charm, I'm not so sure if all lawyers have that. I've spent enough time around lawyers, and I have some good friends that are lawyers. Charm is not necessarily always their forte.
It's not a prerequisite.
But, with the time, think of it this way. Like if I'm a professor at Lewis University, I can't just take off for 3 weeks to campaign. I can't just take off in the middle of the semester to run down to Springfield and be a legislator. legislator. But lawyers, they often have that built-in flexibility where they're able to schedule court dates, they're able to take time away from their firm, they're able to rise to the level of partner and then shift some of the work onto associate lawyers. And so that gives them a bit of a head start rather than having to wait to
So
retire.
unemployed people should run for office.
But then they don't have the money.
That's true.
Yeah, that's the barrier. And, scientists have a reputation for being a little bit different thinkers, maybe a little bit
What do you mean?
awkward.
I'm
not saying it's true. I'm
what
just
are you saying, Mallory?
a
Come on.
stereotype.
It
I
is a
mean, I'm awkward.
We all are in some sense. Mallory.
So
Pregnant pause there.
yeah.
Pondering that question. Steve, I was wondering, when you talk about early in the history of the country, and there was just, you said the Democratic Republican Party became dominant, and there was a one-party rule. But part of my mind was then saying, they were able to get broad-based support within the American populate. They voted for them. Who was driving the agenda? Was the agenda being driven by the party, or was the party actually conforming to what they thought the people wanted?
Yeah, if I'm going to answer that question from the perspective of someone in 1850 or so, when at that point we had the Whig Party and the Democrats, the Whigs get fractured by slavery because it was very clear that the Northern Whigs and the Southern Whigs had very different opinions about whether or not humans should be able to own other humans, and so the Republican Party kind of comes in over the issue of slavery. And they were the party of abolition. They were the party of Abraham Lincoln. And so in that sense, they were being driven by an ideology, but I think that the demand was there in the population for an abolitionist party. The fact that slavery was kind of like the original sin of this country and has, affected political discourse from the founding up until the Civil War into today, shows that there's always going to be, or there was always going to be demand for a political party that was going to stand up and say this is wrong. Now in modern times, I'm not so sure if I would answer that question the same way. That the political parties are. I kind of lost my train of thought there, but like one of
the things I was going to ask about is like platforms.
Yeah.
And so when they have the national convention, the party is supposed to come up with a platform to let everybody know this is what we stand for. Mm-hmm. And then the question is who's driving that platform? Is the platform being driven by the politicians, or are they arguing about what the needs of the country are and what the needs of the people are, and therefore this is what we're going to stand up for?
I would answer a third option probably. I don't think it's necessarily the politicians, because from the politician's perspective, the platform is useful as a marketing tool maybe, but someone who's actually elected into Congress doesn't have to listen to that platform. They're free to vote however they want. So if it says that our party is going to, cut taxes, the actual representative doesn't have to actually vote to cut taxes.
Right.
And I worry that the platform is being used for propaganda, because they'll say these things, but then they have, in some situations, especially today, no intention of actually following through on what they tell people they believe in.
Yeah. And so the third answer that I think is, does the platform come from the politicians or the people? I think it comes from the party elites, which aren't necessarily politicians. It comes from the donor class, the volunteers, the activists. These are people that are usually highly attuned to politics. They're usually highly educated. They're more likely to donate, to volunteer. And they're the ones that are paying attention to things like the party platform. The average voter wouldn't even know where to find it. If you gave them an assignment, if I assigned it in class, find the Democratic Party platform, without using Google. Good luck.
Oh, well,
yeah.
I was going to Google it.
Well, wasn't it true that in 2020, the Republicans didn't even issue?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say that. And the question is this an entirely out-of-date way of thinking about politics? In 2020, at the Republican convention, the Republicans didn't even bother trying to
agree on things. Well, they're so fractured.
An actual policy platform. What I think it was like a 2-statement thing. They said basically we support Donald Trump for president.
Do you think that the Republicans are going to fracture again over to like the extreme conservative side versus the more moderate side?
In some sense, they already have. I mean, we are recording this the day after, for the first time in U.S. history, sitting Speaker of the House was voted out of that position by the chamber.
Yeah.
And
it only took 8 Republicans.
Yeah. So, I mean, so there's two ways of looking at that question, right? On one hand, it's only 8 Republicans that forced this, that the vast majority of the Republican Party was still just fine with Kevin McCarthy remaining as Speaker. But at the same time, the fact that the Republican Party is so divided between, as soon as I started that sentence, I realized I didn't like what I was saying there, because they're not super divided. They are incredibly cohesive as a conservative unit. But the difference is largely in their tone that they're trying to convey. You have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz that are, want a combative tone to their politics, whereas the vast majority of the Republican caucus would agree with the positions of Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz and the more extreme
Lauren Boebert.
Yeah, Lauren Boebert. We can rattle off the whole roster of conservative Republicans. They're the average typical Republican is almost just as conservative as those people, but often doesn't like the practical politics of that approach that they come at.
Have we gotten to a winner take all type of a situation where the hardcore on both sides are basically saying compromise is now bad, and anybody who was willing to compromise with the other side is no longer going to be supported by us, and instead of saying, well, we have a diverse nation and we need to collaborate with each other, it just seems like each side is saying we are going to impose what we want on you when we get into the majority.
Yes. But let me give a little bit of evidence for that. So in the last election in 2022, I remember just looking at these stats for a class. Do you want to guess how many races or what percentage of congressional races were decided by 5 points or less?
I think it was a very small number.
Yeah, it was single digits. It was like 7 or 8%.
Oh, wow.
It's all predetermined.
Yeah.
It's almost all predetermined. There's only a few races that are deciding whether which party is going to be in the majority. I
mean, barring some sort of scandal or somebody dying in office or something like that, I can already tell you what the top 20 closest races are going to be in the next election, with some degree of error. But so put yourself in the position of a member of Congress in that environment where you are running from a district that is lock solid either as a Democratic district or a Republican district. So if you are concerned about re-election, your only chance of losing is going to be from a primary challenge. And those primary challenges almost invariably are going to come from the ideological extreme. So if you're a Republican in a normal Republican district that is 12 points slanted in favor of the Republican Party, you don't have to worry about reaching out to the Democrats. You don't need the Democratic votes. Quite frankly, doing so is going to tick off the Republican voters that you need their support in the primary. So the incentive is to shift to the right in that situation. And for the Democrats, it would be to shift to the left in that situation.
This is where gerrymandering actually has a real world impact, so that the power elites within each of the parties, when they get control within their own individual state, draw the lines so that this is in fact how it comes out.
Yes. And the gerrymandering is, for those that don't know, it's the intentional drawing of congressional districts to favor usually one political party over another. And because the state legislatures are granted that authority to redraw the district lines after each census, they're going to do so to favor their political party. These maps are not, coming down from on high. They're created by politicians. Politicians are creating their own voters.
And then the opposite party takes it to the courts.
Yes.
Almost invariably.
I mean, take a state like Wisconsin. Wisconsin, just north of us, is about as close of a 50-50 state as you can get right now, right? Donald Trump eked out a win in Wisconsin in 2016. Joe Biden won narrowly in 2020. They've had several very close governor's races. So at the state level, it's a 50-50 state. at their state legislature level, because they were allowed to gerrymander and the Republicans controlled the process, they have veto-proof 2/3 majorities.
Oh, wow.
In both houses. And so you can get that kind of distortion with gerrymandering. And students always are like, well, like, how do they know how people are going to vote? Well, this is where the science comes in, right? Like, gerrymandering's been around for centuries. Like 1812, I think, is when the term is used. It was actually originally pronounced Gerrymander because it was named after the governor of Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry, and he drew the lines to favor the Federalist Party. And so this has been going on for centuries, but it was never as acute of a problem until we started getting block-level census data, GIS mapping technology. You can overlay consumer spending habits and other types of demographic surveys and political surveys on top of that census data using matching and other types of interpolation. And so now you can get an incredibly accurate, down to the city block level of where people are going to vote and who they're likely to vote for.
Can I ask ChatGPT to just tell me?
You could probably ask ChatGPT to draw the whole map.
Yeah, I'd be like, can you draw a fair map? And then can you draw a map?
Now, I mean, I do want to point out that, like, I think gerrymandering is one of the low-hanging fruit in solving our political problems. Low-hanging in that we can point to this and say, this is bad. This is leading to bad political outcomes. It's not the only issue. If we snap our fingers and get rid of gerrymandering, it's not like everything's going to go back to singing Kumbaya around the campfire.
There was never Kumbaya.
Because, for instance, states aren't gerrymandered, and we still see the same polarization happening in the U.S. Senate. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Democrats have concentrated in cities and Republicans and conservatives have largely stuck to rural areas. And
why do you think
out.
That is?
That's more of like a sociological question, but I think there is a draw to Democrats, or I should say liberals in general, being more accepting of diversity, more accepting of city life. And
I also think the economy has a role in that. In that money has been flowing into urban areas and out of rural areas.
Right.
And then it's just a matter of which political party is going to lean into that to talk about how things are being taken away from you, and we're going to restore the way things were. Life in rural areas is very different than life in urban areas today, and it's always kind of been that way. Yeah. Urban areas have always had a very different type of culture than rural areas.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, well, we're running out of time here, folks, so we would like you to know that the views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the speaker's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Lewis University. The material and information presented here is for general information purposes only. The Lewis University name and all forms and abbreviations are the property of its owner, and its use does not imply endorsement of or opposition to any specific organization, product, or service. This podcast was produced in the WLRA podcast studios at Lewis University. Visit lewisu.edu for more information about Lewis University. You've been listening to Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White.
And today,
Dr. Stephen Nawara.
Thanks, Steve.
See you next time.
Take care.